This is Canada's Cast and Blast podcast, dedicated to anglers and hunters. For amazing tips and demonstrations that you've heard about right on this podcast, visit castandblastcanada.com. And now let's join the boys deep in the woods lakeside. We'll find Roger Tuminieri and Brian Glassy.
Hey there, everybody. Thanks for joining us on episode 3 of Canada's Cast and Blast podcast. I'm your co-host, Roger Tuminieri, and here's your host, Brian Glassy. Hey, Brian, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks, Roger. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for listening to the podcast. It's been a great couple of weeks, and I think Roger and I have got some interesting things to go through this week.
Yes, we do, including a fun experience from this morning's early morning, sort of mid to late season turkey hunt. But before we do that, let's give a shout out to our sponsors. First off, we'd like to thank APPAREL Co, makers of locally inspired apparel for special places in Ontario. You can check them out at apparelco.ca.
We'd also like to thank Lucky Bug Lures, excellent Canadian company who makes some really interesting and unique lures. We're going to go through a bunch of those today when we're talking about walleye and pike.
But before we do that, let's talk turkey for a sec. So we've talked a bit of turkey in episodes 1 and 2, and as we reach the end of our spring turkey season here in Ontario, I'd like to tell just a quick story. I was up early this morning, haven't done a heck of a lot of turkey hunting this season, but I was up at 5, out in the back 40 by about 5:30, just after legal light. And sure enough, as I'm sure a lot of turkey hunters can attest, they're gobbling all around me, to the left, to the right, behind me, but I just couldn't see any turkey. So I called back and I had a few turkey conversations, and then it went silent, completely silent. And I started to get a little bit antsy. I needed some coffee, so I decided to pack it in. I left my decoy out there, came back to the house around 8, hung out for a bit, went back out to feed the horses, and sure enough, there was a turkey out by my decoy. So obviously I didn't have my bow. I don't feed the horses with my bow. So I ran back to my house to get my bow because I don't feed the horses and carry a bow at the same time. So I threw my face mask on. I still had my camo. And I went out to put the sneak on this turkey, and I closed in from maybe 200 yards to about 50 yards. And all of a sudden he up and jumped and flew over the fence. We back onto a rail trail, and I look over my right shoulder and I couldn't believe it, but there was this lady walking along the trail. And I think unfortunately she spooked the turkey. Could have been me, but I think it was an interesting experience. I've never been so close to a turkey. In fact, I've never even seen a turkey while hunting. I always tend to see them while I'm driving or walking around without a shotgun or a bow. But man, what an exciting experience.
I mean, it's proof that you need to get everything right. I had a similar experience. I've got permission on 200 acres of farmland close to my house. And I went out scouting last week. Found a big tom out strutting in one of the fields that I have permission on at about 6 o'clock in the evening. He was huge, big enough that his beard was dragging on the ground. Very exciting. So I made a plan, called the landowner, let him know I was coming in the next morning, went in, set up on the bush line on that field. First light, just like you, gobbles off to my right. I called back. He answered me. We talked back and forth 3 or 4 times. And I think I made a rookie mistake by just over calling. So when he started calling to me, I called back to him. He started coming towards me, gobbling. I'm calling back to him. And I think, again, like we discussed in the last podcast, these big toms are used to the females coming to them, right? They present themselves and puff up, and usually the girls come running. And I think that was the error that I made, was that I was trying to make him come to me, and I overcalled to him, and he just kind of faded off. I'm sure he didn't see me. I never even saw him. I could tell he was getting closer from his gobbling, but then he just kind of faded off into the bush behind me. So learning experience. Like we keep saying, if I'm presented with that scenario again, I think I'll have a better idea as to what I should do. I've talked about it with my hunting mentor and a couple of other really good turkey hunters. And, sometimes the hunter wins and oftentimes the turkey wins. So, learning experience. It was exciting at least to have turkeys here. And it was a good time.
Yeah, I guess if it was easy, Brian, they'd call it turkey eating.
That's right. That's exactly right. So I think that's going to be my last turkey hunt for the year. I may try to get out one more time, but when I went back to scout again this week, my buddy who owns the property was out there in his tractor tilling the fields. So that probably has messed things up for that property for the remainder of the season, unfortunately. But that's okay because I'm fully into the fishing now. So.
Yeah, speaking of fishing, you've been putting up some quick videos on our YouTube channel, and we've listed them on our website at castandblast.ca. I really like what you're doing there with these real quick tips, Brian. You want to talk quickly about those videos?
Yeah, you bet. I'm trying to do kind of a beginner series for people who are just starting to get into fishing. Really quick videos, 2 minutes or less. Some of them are only 30 seconds long, going over little tips and tricks. Again, like we always try to say, the devil is in the details. If you want to be a good angler, it's not doing one big thing different. It's doing a whole bunch of small things differently. And so I'm trying to flesh out a lot of those things. So the first couple of videos I put up were my small stream setup. Talked about that in episode number 2. I've still got to put up my large river setup and the lake setups that I use for trout. This morning, I just posted another one that was talking about fluorocarbon leaders and why you might want to use a fluorocarbon leader. So I'm going to continue to do that. Keep checking back to castandblast.ca and the Cast and Blast Canada YouTube channel. We're going to try to post at least a couple of videos every single week with more and more tips.
It's really cool when you break it down like that, because I think that's very useful for folks that are just getting into fishing. And I know even for myself, I've been fishing, for a few years. By no means would I consider myself an expert, but I do like what you're doing there, Brian, and get a lot of value from that. So hopefully our listeners will as well. And
one more thing to our listeners, please provide feedback. If you're liking what I'm doing, let me know. If there are topics you'd like me to discuss, let us know. Drop a comment into the comment section on the YouTube channel. Send us a message through the website. We would love to provide content to you that's relevant for you and that you're going to like. So please let us know.
All right. So we talked turkey, and now we're talking fish. What's coming up in terms of new season openers, Bri?
All right. So depending on where you are in Southern Ontario, the Walleye and Pike season opened in Southern Ontario the second Saturday in May, and everywhere else in the province pretty well opens the third Saturday in May. So either it's already open or it's just about to. So primary species we're looking at are walleye and pike. I wanted to start with a quick little discussion about walleye because there's an specifically Ontario thing where for some reason walleye have always been known as pickerel in Ontario, especially in Northern Ontario. So I just wanted to address that quickly. I'm going to personally call them walleye because that's the taxonomical name for them. Growing up, they were always pickerel to me. And so if you want to refer to them as pickerel, that's fine. I understand completely what you're saying. For anybody outside of Ontario who's listening to this, when you hear us talking about pickerel, we're really talking about walleye.
Sounds good.
All right. So let's talk about what we're going to be doing for walleye, and then we'll talk about pike as well. So let's start with the basics on walleye. Springtime is spawning season for both walleye and pike. For walleye, the spawn should be either on now or just about finished, depending on where you are. They try to set the seasons so that they don't open until the fish have gotten through their spawn or most of the way through their spawn. So what walleye are looking for when they're spawning are generally current areas and shallower areas where they can come in and lay eggs. So that's where I'm going to be when I'm looking for walleye. I'm looking for the best places on the lakes that I fish are generally where there's an inflow into the lake. So I'm looking for a river or a stream or some kind of fresh water entering into the lake. If it's entering into a back bay that's shallower, all the better. That's where I'm going to start. But once I get in there, A, the water temperature, and B, the fish will tell me if that's really where they are when I'm there. So I was out on my local lake last week, and the water temperature was only between 50 and 52 degrees. So still really cold. Now it's warmed up since then. We've got some beautiful 25-degree days coming up, and the lakes are going to warm up quickly. But the walleye in my local lake were very lethargic and slow. They're still either pre-spawn or just coming into the spawn now. And so what I'm going to be doing when I'm fishing will be dependent on the water temperature and what I'm seeing the fish doing. So in my boat, I've got a fish finder where I'm marking fish. I'll be able to see if there's fish there or not based on what I'm seeing on the fish finder. And then the water temperature is really going to dictate what we're going to do. In speaking with somebody, so when I was out, I didn't really catch any walleye. We boated a couple of pike and a couple of out-of-season bass. But the walleye were a little bit elusive. And when I was pulling the boat out at the launch, I talked to somebody who had a limit of walleye and asked him what he was doing. And he said he was trolling body baits, minnow imitations very slowly, 1 mile an hour or less. And so that's much slower than I would normally fish for any species, but that's dependent on the water temperature. So we need to remember that fish are cold-blooded, and that means that their energy levels and their ability to move around is really dictated by the temperature of the water. So the warmer the water, the more energy they're going to have, the more ability they're going to have to chase down a bait. So even though I was moving slowly, 1.5 miles or less, I was still moving too quickly for the water temperature. And I'm going to go this weekend. I'm headed up to the family cottage, and I've got 3 or 4 spots on the lake where there's an inflow into a shallow bay that would be a spawning bay. I'm going to start in those bays first. I'll go over what the applications are that I'm going to use. But if I happen to not catch any fish in those areas, what I'm going to look for is adjacent cover and structure close to those areas. So let me define those 2 terms really quickly for you. Structure would be anything underwater that fish can relate to. So generally, we're talking about underwater islands, points, sunken timber, boulder fields, things like that. Fish generally relate to structure. They might be right in it on certain occasions or close to it. The other one is cover. Cover would be where you've got either docks or overhanging trees or things like that that really provide overhead cover over top of the water where fish can get in there and hide. So again, the fish use this stuff as ambush points where they tuck themselves under a tree and wait for prey to swim by them, and then they dart out and try to grab that. So if those fish are not in those back bays where there's current, the next thing I'm going to do is try to find some sort of cover or structure adjacent to those bays and fish that. So usually the first main lake point out from one of those back bays is a good place to start, especially if there's structure or cover on that point. Islands that are close by, or if you have Navionics, and that's an app for your phone, but you can also buy a Navionics chip to go in your fish finder. I would strongly recommend that at the very least you download the Navionics chart, because that's going to show you any areas where there are sunken islands. So what I'm looking at on Navionics is a topographical map of the lake bed. And so what I'm looking for is areas underwater that top out somewhere between 4 and 15 feet deep that are surrounded by deeper water. The larger that structure is underwater, the more chance it has of holding fish. So the fish are going to be early in the season into the spawning bays. Once they're done spawning, they hang around that bay for a little while. Usually those really shallow bays kind of come to life first in a lake because they're a little shallower. They warm up a little quicker. Minnow species, plankton, crayfish, all the kind of prey stuff will come alive in those back bays first. So the fish, after they're done spawning, will be in there. They slowly transition from those areas out into the main lake, into those main lake structures as the water temperature warms. So the fish are really going to dictate where they are in the season. That's kind of what I'm looking for in terms of where I'm going to fish. If you're shorebound, the place to look is current areas. So generally, if I'm looking for a shore spot, there's lots of this kind of spot in the Kawarthas where you can fish from shore close to a dam or a set of locks. Usually they have current. Neck down areas where a lake gets narrow, or there's a place where there's wind or current blowing through part of mainland with an island close to shore. Those kind of areas where what I'm looking for is current. If you can throw in rock rubble and or weed growth into that area, your chances are good that you're looking at a really good spot to try. So don't assume that you need to have a boat to be able to fish these species. You absolutely don't. There's lots of areas where you can shore cast for them. If there's wind blowing into that spot, all the better. Remember, wind can create current just like water flowing. Okay. So what are kind of my top techniques I'm going to use for fishing walleye? And there's probably 3 main techniques that I'm going to focus on this coming weekend when I'm fishing. The first is a real classic. It's a jig and a minnow. Okay, so a jig is just a really basic ball of lead in the front with a hook attached to it. I'm going to use either a live minnow, or I really like the Berkeley Max Scent flat nose minnows. I've been doing really well with those lately over the last couple of years. If you can't get live bait for whatever reason, or you're struggling to keep live bait alive, some of the better quality plastic baits by Berkeley and Kitech and some of the other ones like that are really good options. So with a jig, generally walleye are bottom oriented fish, especially at this time of year. So I'm going to be casting the jig out, letting it sink all the way to bottom on a semi-slack line. And then I'll give my rod tip a bit of a pop to hop the jig up off of the bottom and let it sink back down on a semi-slack line. The hit almost always comes when the bait is falling. And the way you'll know that the hit has happened is either you'll see your line, if you're watching your line, just have a very slight little movement, or you'll feel a little bit of a tick on your line. So often with walleye, especially early season, the hit is not like a bass slamming it and you have a fish there. It's more like just a little doop, and you feel a little tap, like somebody had tapped your rod with their finger. And if you feel that, or you see your line do a little twitch, set the hook. The chances are very strong that that's a walleye. Okay. Colors, I like a bunch of different colors. Depending on the water color, I will adjust colors. In really clear water, I like to use more natural hues, blacks, browns, dark greens, that kind of thing, or silver even. In colored water, or if the fish are hitting aggressively, you can usually do better if you upgrade to a more brightly colored lure. So hot pink, orange, fire tiger, those are all really good options. I don't know what it is about orange, but For me, orange is maybe my go-to color for walleye. Musky as well. Certain species seem to really like orange. So I'm going to be jig fishing for walleye. The other two ways you could fish them are with body baits. So I'm really excited to try out the latest Lucky Bug lure, the F-Bomb. It's a minnow style bait, similar to a floating Rapala, Storm Thunder Stick. There's lots and lots of other options. The Lucky Bug version has a really unique little roll and twitch to it, and I'm really excited to try that out. It's pretty basic fishing when you're using a lure like that. You cast it out and you reel it in. What I'm really going to focus on is water temperature again. So if the water's still really cold, 55 degrees or less, you got to be reeling that really, really slow. If it's above 55 degrees, I might try being quite a bit more aggressive, jerking the rod tip hard, trying to make the lure act erratically. Sometimes if the water is warm and the fish are on, that can produce much more fish than fishing really slowly. So be open to experimentation. And again, that's just cast it out and reel it in. If I'm doing that, I'm looking to bring the lure along the edge of any structure that might be there. So if I'm seeing emergent weeds starting to grow, I'm trying to cast it either over top and work it just above the tops of the weeds, or along either the outside edge or the inside edge of the weed bed. The fish generally aren't, unless they're really spooked or really shut off, they're generally not dug right into the weeds. Generally, they're relating to one side or the other. And then lastly, the other one that I really like is a drop shot rig. And a drop shot rig is a little bit different because rather than the weight being at the very end of the line, like with a jig, with the hook at the end of the line, the hook is, 12 to 18 inches above the weight. So that's going to be another one that I do one of our quick tip videos on, is showing you how to set up a drop shot and what it looks like. So check out the YouTube channel and the website for that. So those will be the three main ways that I'm going to fish walleye. The other thing we need to talk about is pike.
Yep.
So pike can be very frustrating mid-season, because pike are actually, even though most people think of shallow, weedy water for pike, pike are a cold water species. So once the water temperature gets over 55 to 60 degrees, most of the pike, especially the big ones, are gone into deeper water, and that makes them harder to find. But early spring, I'm hoping that the water temperature will still be cold, because they can be really predictable really early in the season. I'm almost exclusively looking for shallow, dark bottomed bays on the lakes that I'm going to be fishing for pike. So we're talking, no more than 8 feet deep. If it's got a dark bottom or rock bottom, rock shelf bottom, those are really great places to start. Those bays end up warming up the earliest. Lots of different options for pike. I'm going to give you one little secret that I probably shouldn't share, but it's been one of my best tips over the last few years. Often on my home lake, Cottage Lake, I see early in the season guys fishing with gigantic spoons and gigantic lures, and they're throwing, 6, 8, 10-inch baits. And yes, you can, if the pike are really on, you can catch some big pike on those baits. I'm not going to say that won't work. But often I will fish right behind these guys and go through with a much smaller lure and pick off all kinds of fish. And my number one lure early in the year is a number 3 spinner. So Mepps, Blue Fox, and Panther Martin are the 3 brands that I use, interchangeable as far as I'm concerned. But, I'll use a silver number 3 Blue Fox Vibrax spinner, cast it out, let it sink all the way to the bottom, and reel it as slowly as I can. And that accounted for the 3 biggest pike that I caught last year. The last 10 years, that little pattern has put more big pike in my boat than everything else combined.
Speaking of big fish, Bri, we got some nice photos of you on the website and on a new Facebook page. What kind of fish are those that you're holding? Are they pike?
So yeah, the main one that I'm holding up was caught on that number 3 Vibrax spinner.
Are you serious? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the exact pattern that I was using. I was in a little back bay. Me and a friend were fishing. He was fishing something big. I saw that big pike follow his big lure in, but not commit. I casted back out with the little spinner, super slow, and boom, there it was. So yes, there's pictures of me holding pike on the website. There's going to be more to come. I'm going out tomorrow for trout into Lake Ontario. So hopefully we'll have some reports and some videos from that. I'll post pictures if we catch anything. And again, this coming weekend, I'm going to be fishing pike and walleye exclusively at the Cottage Lake, and I'm hoping to film some more stuff there and get some more pictures of pike and walleye to show all of our listeners.
Fantastic. Those are some really good tips, Bri.
There'll be lots more tips and photos like that coming, Roger, in the next episode of the podcast. So please tune in, everybody. Thanks again for listening. We'll talk to you again soon.
This has been Canada's Cast and Blast podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening, and if that happens to be on YouTube, hit the notification button so you'll be told every time we post something new. All of the episodes are available at castandblastcanada.com.